So over on the JP side of the game, we have this whole arts festival extravaganza thing going on, and it seemingly to coincide with this big arts festival, they went ahead and gave KAGETORA a buff, which I am very excited about. The buff is extremely strong, addressing one of the areas of concern that I had with KAGETORA, but also giving her an additional buff that I don't think people are talking about for its properties for free-to-play accounts, and that she has applications as a single target looper now, which can be very strong for more free-to-play accounts that do not have, say, you know, a Berserker Kentoki at like NP2 or 3, and they use them to chunk everything in the game. They gave her something that's going to help her out in that area, and I think most people are just talking about the first buff they gave her and not the second one. So we're going to talk about that in today's video. But before we begin, if you have not already, make sure you leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel for that daily FGO content, and sometimes I might even, you know, go ahead and double upload, so stay tuned for that. And I'd also like to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments down below on this buff, but first, let me go ahead and talk about this buff and what areas it addressed and why it's actually a very strong buff for KAGETORA, before you go ahead and drop your opinion down in the comments down below. So if you didn't know, KAGETORA's first skill is pretty solid. It's not the craziest thing in the world, but you know, it gives her a 30% arts buff for 1 turn and some decent star weight for that same turn as well on a 5-turn cooldown. You know, nothing super offensive, but it does make her more of a burst damage servant along the lines of, say, Assassin Lee Shuin or Munanori, which isn't a bad thing. Sometimes you do just need some very strong burst damage, and in KAGETORA's case herself, you guys have seen me bring her to different challenge quests and whatnot. Every now and then I'll upload a good challenge quest video and we'll bring her there and it's pretty fine. But the annoying thing about the arts buff only being 1 turn is that, for one, you lose out on a lot of her damage. KAGETORA being a free-to-play NP5 servant, one of the better things about them is that they can do very good damage because you get them as a free NP5, but then only having one of her main buffs for 1 turn does make her a bit of a burst damage servant, which can be a little annoying because even though she can get through the content, it might be a little more wonky because you'll do this really good turn of damage. You know, ideally you have like an arts chain going because you get the extra buff to her arts card's damage, but also the NP gain. You're absorbing all those crit stars, so they're probably going to be arts crits on top of that. So you fully refund her NP, but then the next NP just doesn't do as much damage, which is always really unfortunate. But then also on top of that, for the next 4 turns while the skill cooldown is up, you know, you're still waiting for that arts buff to give you back the NP gain that she really needs, because her natural NP gain is only 0.45%, which isn't the crazy thing by any stretch of the imagination. Thankfully, she does also give herself an NP gain buff on her second skill, but that's tied to her survivability, so you don't always want to just use that just to refund your NP. You might need that to live an upcoming hit that the boss is going to hit you with on a break bar or whatever. So that is the first thing they actually addressed with KAGETORA. They took her 30% arts buff and extended it to be 3 turns, which I already love. It means that clears with her are going to be a lot more smooth. It's only down for 2 turns, so her damage is going to feel much more consistent. Her NP gain is going to feel a lot better. You're not going to be as pressured into using the second skill if you really need to loop her NP back or anything like that. Although I could also just understand the argument that, well, Castoria gives you so much survivability anyway with her 3rd skill and her NP, you can't afford to use it for that, but you're less inclined to have to do that nowadays. And her really solid single target NP5 damage is going to be more free and available to you more often. But the other thing that they threw her way that I don't think is really being talked about, because obviously her getting the arts buff for 3 turns is a big deal. It takes her from a burst damage servant into a more consistent servant, but she also got a 20% battery, which, to be fair, my initial thought was, oh, that's kind of nice. You know, a 20% battery, that's just kind of cute that they gave that to her. I guess it'll help her out with certain starting charge CEs, and, you know, maybe it'll make her a little bit more consistent whenever you fire this. You know, 20% NP is never bad. But then I thought about it, you know, thinking about it in the context of, well, starting charge CEs and whatnot. And this 20% combined with her passive append skill, which as a free-to-play, you know, they give you the servant coins and whatnot, especially as we now have the evocation stuff going on where you can not only get the free-to-play servant, their copies, their ascension materials, but also all the coins you'll ever need. You can get that up to the skill level 10. That gives her 40% in total. With double Castoria, you know, just with her first skill, that's 60% you get from there. She can auto get to her NP for these different farming nodes without having to take the extra 220% from Castoria's second skill. So it makes her really, really strong if you need a single target to just chunk somebody. Now, obviously, she'll be a little bit limited in who she's able to chunk, because even though her damage is good, it's not like she has any ramping damage or doesn't really have a way to, hit guys with a power mod. Although I wouldn't be surprised that since the ruler Kagetora has a man attribute power mod, I wouldn't be surprised if our Lancer Kagetora got a buff sometime in the future, that maybe gave her some type of power mod on her own NP or on her second skill, whatever have you, whatever they want to, chuck onto her to give her just a little bit of a niche. In which case, she'd be exceptionally good as a free-to-play option that would always be available in the invocation shop for you to just go ahead and pick up. But even right now, her damage is like really free, and the fact that you can kind of just use her as a single target, now everybody has her at their disposal, I think is really sick. As you guys know, I'm also a huge fan of Kagetora, so the fact that she's the one that's getting that role, she gets to fill the position of, yeah, I'm kind of like the free-to-play big chunk damage guy, that also just makes me really happy. It means that Kagetora is going to see a lot more usage, because again, I could understand if people weren't really, all that gassed to use Kagetora, because maybe they're like, well, her first skill kind of falls off, after one turn, and, maybe there's better options to go for. But now you go into challenge quests, she's just kind of, as I would describe, generically good. She's not doing anything super special. There's no niche or gimmick. There's no ramping damage. There's nothing that you're building up for. There's no power mod that she's like specifically really good into. She's just going to kind of be good in every avenue, just doing good generic things that kind of support the party as well, with her third skill being very strong if you bring a secondary DPS. The fact that she not only lowers the enemy's critical attack chance to kind of keep your supports around, but also removes their offensive buffs, so she and the supports are not getting hit as hard. She's just now like a generically good, really strong servant. And it's crazy how just a simple buff that they chucked her way could not only just help her out so significantly in making her more consistent in challenge quests and exhibition quests, stuff along those lines, but also giving herself the 20% battery does mean that she'll be very strong as a farming servant. I think this is a very, very strong buff. The only thing that I kind of wish we did get was maybe an additional buff for somebody else. Them just kind of dropping one buff at a time, at least, unless I miss them dropping another buff alongside Kagetora's buff. But yeah, it's a little slow, but I do like that the JP version is rolling out these different buffs for all these units. At least we're still getting semi-consistent buffs, every couple of weeks. It's like what, like been every 3 or so weeks, people have been receiving these buffs over on JP. I think that's very strong, because as I talked about on stream a good few weeks ago, you can't just roll out these buffs, at like 2 points during the year for, an interlude campaign, and then for anniversary, and then for New Year's. You got to do it a bit more frequently, because think of the servants that really need help. Your Saber Giles, your Jacqueline Hyde, your Summer Kiyohimes, these units that really don't have a use case right now, that are going to need at least like 2 or 3 buffs to start being good. So if you start just rolling out these buffs, every now and then, you have it with some level of consistency, some of those units that aren't super great will finally get to see the light of day. It does make me very optimistic for people like, Mata Hari in the future, who I would really like to use for certain reasons. No reason in particular why I'd want to use Mata Hari, but they're just not all that great. But if we start rolling out buffs with a bit more consistency, kind of like this, even if it is just one at a time, if they're still just coming out with some level, that we could just reliably see them coming out, then it makes me happy for the prospects of, the game for future servants that aren't so good. So to speak, that Kagetora was already pretty fine, now she's pretty solid, with the only thing that I would want her to get is maybe like a power mod or some type of ramping damage, something along those lines. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'm very excited about this buff. I'm very, very glad that I do have a JP account. As you guys can see in the background, I've just been kind of toying around with Kagetora in some different fights. And I will just say, it feels a lot better to use her now. She just feels much better. And it's crazy what you can do with one simple buff to a servant that was already pretty solid and maybe didn't need it. And then you give them this buff, you're like, wow, this is just really, really nice for them. So let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace, light, guys.